Emma Clark paced around the small living room, her phone pressed tightly against her ear. Sweat beaded on her forehead as the scorching sun poured through the open window. Her hands trembled and her voice was sharp with frustration. "No, Mama, I strongly disagree. Don't tell me that. I will not die because I'm a mother. There are easier ways to get things done, and I'm choosing that way," she said firmly, her free hand waving in the air as if to emphasize her point. Her mother on the other end of the call remained calm. "We are not fighting now, Emma. Calm down. I'll see what I can do." Emma's mother, known as Noah, stepped out of her car and stretched her stiff legs. She had just arrived at her goddaughter's home. The moment she entered the compound, the sound of little feet rushing toward her filled the air. "Mama, Mama!" the children shouted as they ran to greet her, their tiny arms wrapped around her as she laughed and patted their heads. "Ah, my children, thank you, she exclaimed as she walked with them into the house. Once inside, she dropped her bag and crashed onto one of the old worn-out couches. She let out a relieved sigh before asking, "Where is your mother?" The children immediately started arguing about her whereabouts. "She went to the farm," one said. "No, she went to Mama Nkechi's shop," another insisted. Noah chuckled, watching them with amusement until a teenage girl appeared, stretching. "Oluchi," Noah called, smiling warmly. Oluchi rubbed her sleepy eyes and greeted, "Good afternoon, ma." "Ah, Oluchi, you're not a grown woman, no," Noah said, smiling. My mother went to see someone. She'll soon be back." Noah's face turned serious. "Well, how is she now? I heard she was terribly sick." Oluchi's smile widened. "She's better now." Just as she spoke, Amaka, her mother, walked in. The moment she saw Noah, she let out a joyful scream and ran into her arms. They held onto each other tightly, their laughter and chatter filling the room. Oluchi and her siblings quietly excused them, knowing they had a lot to talk about. As evening fell, Noah prepared to leave. She called the children and handed them Crip's 2,000 naira notes each. "Thank you, ma," the children chorused, their voices filled with excitement. "Well, call me when you're ready," Noah said to Amaka as she stepped into her car. That night, Amaka called Oluchi when the younger children had gone to bed. Oluchi hurried out of the kitchen, drying her wet hands and her skirts. She was hopeful. Maybe her mother had decided to send her back to school. It had been 2 long years since she last sat in a classroom. "Why are you taking the whole day to wash plates?" Amaka asked, shaking her head. "I cannot wait for you anymore. Sit down, let's talk. You can go back later." Oluchi's heart pounded with excitement as she sat beside her mother. "Oluchi, you are no longer a child. Most of your mates were already in their husband's house when I was your age." Oluchi's smile faded instantly. "Noah came today because she wants you to stay with one of our children in the city. Her daughter needs help with house chores and her children. In return, she will take good care of you and send you back to school." Oluchi's eyes widened. "So, I'll leave this place?" Amaka nodded. "Yes, my daughter. You will have a better life there." A wide smile spread across Oluchi's face. Days later, Oluchi was on her way to Mrs. Clark's house. She sat by the window watching the dusty village roads give way to smooth tarred streets lined with street lights. Everything looked different. She was stepping into a new life, one filled with hope and possibilities. The journey was long. Oluchi had never traveled this far before. Every time she looked out the window, she saw new sights. After what seemed like an eternity, the driver finally turned into a quiet, well-lit street and pulled up in front of a massive gate. He glanced at Oluchi, who was still staring out of the window in awe. "We don't reach you," he said, stepping out to bring down her small travel bag. Before she could knock, the gate creaked open, revealing a tall woman with sharp features and piercing eyes. "You must be Oluchi," Mrs. Clark said, a thin smile on her lips. "Come inside, you're home now." The moment Oluchi stepped in, her breath caught in her throat. The house was bigger than anything she had ever seen. The marble floors gleamed under the bright lights, and the air smelled of expensive perfume. She could barely hide her excitement. Mrs. Clark was a busy woman. Her husband, a well-known politician, was rarely around. Oluchi often wondered if he stayed away because he was afraid of his wife, just like she was. Oluchi was exactly what she wanted: obedient, hardworking, and quiet. But Oluchi couldn't say the same for herself. She became a nanny to the twins, a cook, a cleaner, and an errand girl. She barely had a moment to herself, which was not what she expected. A year passed, yet Mrs. Clark never mentioned Oluchi's education. Fear kept Oluchi from asking, but deep down, she wanted to do something about it. One morning, as Oluchi served her breakfast, Mrs. Clark leaned back in her chair and stared at her. "Why do you want to go to school?" she asked, a cruel smile on her lips. "My mother keeps thanking me for sending you back to school, saying it means a lot to you." "Does it?" she chuckled wickedly. "Look, school is not for everyone. Aren't you content here? At least, it's better than the slum you came from." "Oh, so sorry dear if that was offensive." She smiled. 2 years later, Oluchi finally sat for her WAEC and JAMB exams. She prayed for a miracle, but when the results came out, she had failed. "Mrs. Clark, I'm sorry," she begged one evening, her voice shaking. Mrs. Clark barely looked at her. "Please, get me a pair of scissors." Oluchi's heart pounded. She rushed to get the scissors, relieved that Mrs. Clark was not shouting at her. But when she handed them over, Mrs. Clark gestured to the chair. "Sit down." Confused, Oluchi obeyed. Before she could react, Mrs. Clark grabbed a handful of her thick dark hair and began cutting. Large tufts fell to the ground. How did I not think of this before?" She laughed as she hacked away, making sure the haircut was uneven and ugly. Tears streamed down Oluchi's face, seeing her reflection, but she bit her lip, refusing to sob. Mrs. Clark admired her work, smiling. "Now you look exactly how you should. Live here." That night, Oluchi lay on her small mattress, staring at the ceiling. She hated Mrs. Clark. She hated her life. But going back home wasn't an option. It would break her mother's heart. She finally settled that maybe this was what God had planned for her. The next morning, while she put Mrs. Clark's lunch pack together, Mrs. Clark asked her, "Well, with the obvious proof that school is not meant for you, do you still want to write your exams?" Oluchi bit her lip and replied, "Yes, Mrs. Clark," bowing her head. Mrs. Clark warned her to always look down whenever she was talking to her, except she was instructed to do otherwise. The last time she unconsciously looked up, Mrs. Clark pounded her on the head that led to the loss of her 2 teeth and a headache that lasted for weeks. To her surprise, Mrs. Clark reached into her purse and tossed the money onto the table. "Go and register for the exams." This time, Oluchi vowed to pass no matter what. University was her only escape. She had no friends, no family in the city, but she believed that once she got admitted, she would find a way. Oluchi was surprised one evening when Mrs. Clark walked in holding a man on his shoulders as they walked into the flat. "Go and get my husband's things from the car," she said, still focused on her husband. He looked way older than Mrs. Clark. The twins immediately ran out and embraced him. Oluchi had never seen Mrs. Clark so gentle and obedient. She followed him around, laughing softly, lowering her voice, even serving him food herself. Oluchi too enjoyed his presence as Mrs. Clark barely noticed her, which gave her enough time to read her books. One evening, as she studied at the back of the house, Chief Clark walked past, talking on the phone. When he ended the call, he turned to her. "Are you taking extra lessons for your exams?" She shook her head. "No, sir." He frowned. "Well, that won't do. I will talk to my wife about getting you home tutor," he said, as he smiled and tapped her back. Oluchi smiled for the first time in months, but when Mrs. Clark heard about it, she sighed. Instead of hiring a home tutor, she enrolled Oluchi in an evening school. "You want to learn? Then check there," she said, tossing a pair of sandals at her. Oluchi often got lost in the city, wandering for hours before finding her way, but she never complained. Education was her only hope. One evening, she overheard a heated argument between Mrs. Clark and her husband. He stormed out of the house later, slamming the door so hard that the walls shook. Mrs. Clark locked herself in her room, sobbing. It was then Oluchi learned the truth. Mrs. Clark was not the only wife. She was the third out of 4. She missed Chief too, as she knew that Mrs. Clark's cruelty would begin. The twins liked her just like their father, Chief Clark. While Mrs. Clark stayed indoors all day, the twins played with Oluchi. One evening, after her classes, the sky darkened with heavy rain. She had no money for transport and waited for the rain to stop, but it poured endlessly. When the street emptied, she realized she had no choice but to sleep at the school. She was asleep, not knowing when thoughts came around. She awoke when she felt a weight on her laps, but she was too weak to resist. When she became conscious at dawn, she found no one but pains all over her body. Every step home was an agony. She tiptoed inside, hoping to clean up before anyone saw her. But before she could escape to her room, a hand dragged her blouse. "I've caught you today, you foolish girl." Mrs. Clark's voice rang through the house. Mrs. Clark turned a deaf ear to all Oluchi's pleas. The woman's eyes burned with anger. She flogged Oluchi until silence filled the room. Oluchi had fainted. Mrs. Clark threw the belt on the floor and angrily walked into her room. When Oluchi regained consciousness, the house was quiet. Mrs. Clark had already left for work, taking the twins to school. Weak and in pain, Oluchi dragged herself and took a bath. When she was done, she lay on her bed trying to read a book, but her heavy eyelids closed and she drifted into sleep. The loud beeping of her alarm startled her awake. It was time to prepare dinner. She groaned, her body still ached. She forced herself to get up. She knew she had to hurry. Mrs. Clark would be home soon and there would be trouble if food was not ready. She rushed to the kitchen and decided to make yam and pepper sauce. It was faster to cook and also the twins' favorite. The yam was almost ready and she stirred the pepper sauce carefully when she heard footsteps. Mrs. Clark entered the kitchen, went to the fridge for yogurts. Mrs. Clark entered the kitchen, her sharp eyes scanning the room. She opened the fridge and took out a can of yogurt. "What are you making for dinner?" she asked, taking a sip of the drink. "Yam and pepper sauce," Oluchi replied softly. Mrs. Clark's face twisted with anger. "What rubbish! Is that what's on the menu?" "I'm sorry, ma." Oluchi quickly dropped the spoon and knelt down. "I was only trying to..." Mrs. Clark did not let her finish. She marched to the cooker, turned it off and grabbed the pot of steaming pepper sauce. Before Oluchi could react, Mrs. Clark poured the scalding sauce all over her body. Oluchi let out a piercing scream, her whole body burning with unbearable pain. She ran to her bedroom and turned on the shower, letting cold water run over her skin. But the pain did not stop. She collapsed on the bedroom floor. When she opened her eyes, she was on a hospital bed. A nurse sat beside her, watching closely. Immediately she noticed her awake. She shouted, "She's awake! She's awake!" and ran out of the room. Moments later, the nurse returned with the doctor and Mrs. Clark, who had a fake look of worry on her face. "Doctor, please save my daughter," Mrs. Clark begged, her voice breaking as fake tears rolled down her cheeks. The doctor turned to Oluchi. "My dear, can you tell us what happened to you?" Oluchi opened her mouth, but no words came out. She was weak, confused, and in pain. The doctor continued. "Your guardian here told us you sneaked out to see your boyfriend and returned home with these injuries after you were attacked." Oluchi's eyes widened. She wanted to scream, to deny it, but she had no strength. She turned her head and looked at Mrs. Clark, who had a cold smile on her face. Days later, Oluchi was discharged and taken home. As the days passed, something inside Oluchi changed. The pain, the hunger, the suffering, it all built up into something dark. A thought came to her, one she had never had before. If she wanted to be free, she had to do something fast. The idea terrified her at first, but the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. One morning, the twins ran to Oluchi's room, their small faces filled with worry. "Mommy does not want to wake up, no matter how loud we are," one of them said. "I even slapped her, but she's still not waking up," the other added. Oluchi's heart pounded, but she kept her face calm. She rushed to Mrs. Clark's room, pretending to shake her, and screamed, Ma, wake up!" But there was no response. The gate man heard the noise and came running in. He took one look at Mrs. Clark and called Chief Clark. Hours later, Chief arrived, his face pale, as he called the family doctor. The doctors examined Mrs. Clark's body, but they found nothing. There was no cause of death. It was declared a mystery, and weeks later, she was buried. Chief Clark, not knowing the truth, was filled with guilt for leaving Oluchi alone with his wife. He decided to entrust the twins to her care. He gave the house to her and put her on a monthly salary to take care of them. Oluchi, now free, focused on her studies. She finally gained admission to the university. She also returned to her village. Immediately her family saw her, they rushed out of their small house. Her mother, who had thought Oluchi was dead, screamed in joy and ran to hug her. They rejoiced, laughing and clapping, grateful that she was now rich and successful. But as they celebrated, Oluchi's mind wandered. She smiled, but deep inside she knew there were things her mother would never know, things she would take to her grave. For the first time in years, she felt truly free. But was she really free?